Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our fourth episode of the series with Arizona Law and the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, also known as CUPA, with the NYU Grossman School of Medicine in the Division of Medical Ethics. I am Tara Sklar, a professor of health law and director of the Health Law and Policy program at Arizona Law. We started this series with CUPA over the summer because we saw a number of legal and ethical issues emerging during the pandemic, and also many lessons learned from what we've been seeing going forward. So in case you've missed it, you might be very interested in some of our previous episodes. If you take a look at the chat function, you can see a link to access them. And then just in general, we'll be posting links in chat throughout today's webinar. So please copy and paste anything that you think you might like to check out further. The prior episodes we've done so far cover a range of topics, everything from the development and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines and therapies, to taking care of non-COVID patients during COVID, to using real-world evidence from expanded access, particularly with the convalescent plasma for patients with COVID. So what we try to do in these webinars is include a wide range of perspectives from clinicians, academics, regulators, and importantly, patients and patient advocates. A primary goal that we have in the health law program at Arizona Law is to really have these broad and inclusive discussions with real ethical dilemmas. Our work with CUPA focuses on access to therapies that may not be proven in terms of their safety and efficacy for certain diseases, but in some cases may be a person's only hope to getting a treatment. Related to these discussions, and what COVID has heightened, is incorporating fairness into access to investigational therapies across population groups, which today we're really going to discuss with patients with rare diseases. If any of this sounds of interest, then you may want to take our summer online 6-week course that we offer every summer in partnership with CUPA. It is led by Dr. Allison Bateman-House and Sage Gustafsson. It's called Access to Investigational Products, Clinical Trials, Expanded Access, and Right to Try. This course touches on all the topics I've mentioned so far that we've covered in the webinar, but much more in depth, as well as many others. So we strongly encourage anyone interested to apply, ask for more information, especially those who are patients and patient advocates, to be part of this course or our health law program. For these reasons, in partnership with CUPA, we have created a scholarship to help mitigate any costs or other barriers. So again, in chat, you can see more information about the upcoming summer course, the scholarship that's available. And if you are interested, just to let you know, applications are due in 2 weeks on March 21st. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Regine, who will be moderating today's panel. And thanks so much. We look forward to hearing from you.
Regine, you're muted.
Thank you, Professor Tara Sklar. Before introductions, I want to remind you all of 2 things. First, there will be time for Q&A at the end, so please prepare your questions. You can submit questions anytime through the Q&A function on your screen. Second, we will be recording this webinar, and it will be available on CUPA's website or by email after the event. It is my pleasure to be with you today. My name is Regine Shinimana Maniraho. I am a member of the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, also known as CUPA. I am a trained pharmacist, and I practice as an oncology nurse practitioner at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia, and I will be moderating today's webinar. So today we will be covering a broad overview of what it means to access unapproved medicines outside of clinical trials. This topic has had lots of attention with treatments and vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. But these issues are not new, and we hope this overview of the subject will provide context for the COVID-19 pandemic as well as shed light on issues that have had less attention but are no less important. Expanded access, right to try, and in some cases, emergency use authorizations are all examples of regulatory pathways to access unapproved products outside of a clinical trial. Most pharmaceutical products are unavailable to patients until the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, approves them for marketing once they are shown to be safe and effective for their intended use. However, some patients who might benefit from unapproved drugs may not be able to join a clinical trial, which is why regulatory pathways exist for patients to get unapproved products outside clinical trials. These pathways raise numerous legal, political, and ethical concerns, ranging from informed consent and patients who might not understand the risk to how fairly these unapproved products are shared among patients who might benefit. Patients with rare diseases have an even more difficult time finding effective treatments or clinical trials, and so access to unapproved drugs outside of clinical trials plays an important role in the rare disease community. Today, we will hear from 4 panelists who all have expertise in non-trial pre-approval access. They will address the process of getting access to unapproved products, the ethical concerns, the political challenges, and the impact of these decisions on patients who are hoping for the best possible care in the face of uncertainty. I will introduce the panelists in the order that they will present. Our first presenter is Lisa Kearns. Lisa is a senior researcher in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. She is a long-standing member of one of our sponsoring organizations, the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, Cooper. She has spent years researching different regulatory and ethical issues within this space and will use her experience to give an overview of the topic and some of the primary ethical concerns. Our second presenter is Professor Christopher Robertson. Chris is an Neal Park Scholar and Professor of Law at Boston University. He has taught bioethics, health law, and taught at the University of Arizona, NYU Law, Harvard Law, and Washington University in St. Louis, and served as a reporter for the Health Law Monitoring Committee of the Uniform Law Commission. He will dive into some of the legal and regulatory issues within non-trial pre-approval access and the implications on current and future patients. Our final presenter is Richard White. Rick is a policy analyst at the National Organization for Rare Disorders, where he works on regulatory pathways of pre-approval access. He will share his expertise on the policy issues and specifically on how these policies influence patients with rare disease. With that, I will turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Regine and Tara. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. We're going to start off by defining our terms, although Regine did do a good job of defining a lot of what we need to talk about today. So we're going to talk about investigational medical products. That's the subject of today's talk. And as you saw from the title, they can also be called experimental, unapproved or pre-approved or unproven medical products. And these are just products in development. They're under investigation, hence investigational, that haven't been approved by a regulatory authority, such as the FDA in the US or the EMA in Europe and various ones around the world. There are three ways that patients can access these investigational medical products before they're approved. The first is via clinical trials. The second is via non-trial pre-approval access. And the third is via EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. Now you'll see that I've put a little new sign up there, and honestly, a year ago, nobody talked about EUAs, although they've existed for decades, actually, the ability to do them. And as we saw during the COVID pandemic, that this is another way to access unapproved drugs. The three vaccines that are available now, the Pfizer-BioNTech, the Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson one are all authorized for use, although they're not approved. So this is another way to access pre-approved products. Chris Robertson is going to talk a little more about EUAs. I'm not going to really discuss it further here. So as Regine alluded to, first we have clinical trials, and these are rigorously conducted studies to determine the safety and efficacy of drugs in development. This is what companies do in order to establish this safety and efficacy so they can get regulatory and hence marketing approval, because companies don't make money unless their drugs are on the market. And ethically speaking, we want to make sure that drugs that go into patients are safe and also that they work. So clinical trials are very rigorous. You want to make sure that they're run without bias and that they're tested in the appropriate size populations. Now, clinical trials, in order to be rigorous, they often have strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. And often there are patients who cannot get into clinical trials, but they still want to try something. They still want to try to make themselves better or save their lives. And that's where non-trial pre-approval access comes in. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's access to investigational medical products outside of a clinical trial. In the US, that's also called compassionate use or expanded access. Outside the US, there are many, many terms: named patient, special access scheme, managed access, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This leads to a lot of confusion. I was just at a conference where people were talking about this topic, and every presenter started his or her talk by defining the terms because they're just not the same around the world. But in the US, compassionate use generally refers to single patient access, and expanded access is just the FDA program for accessing investigational products outside of a trial. Now, the two main pathways in the US to get these products outside of a trial are the FDA expanded access pathway and right to try. And of course, there's EUA, but there are still the chief two pathways. And first, we're going to talk about the FDA expanded access pathway. Now, this has been in existence for decades. It was formalized in 1987 during the AIDS epidemic, and it was revised in 2009. And this applies to drugs or devices or biologics, which are like vaccines or biologics. In the FDA pathway, there are three kinds of access. There's access for single patient, which is often called compassionate use. Then there's intermediate and larger size groups, and they all have different, slightly different regulations governing them. And I do direct you to the expanded access site of the FDA's website because it's quite informative and it's really written for a general audience. The drugs or device or biologics, I'm using drugs sort of as a catch-all term, they can be in any stage of development. There are very strict informed consent requirements, and these are governed by the Code of Federal Regulation. And companies can charge only direct manufacturing costs if they provide these drugs outside of clinical trials. Now, it can be no profit made off of this. For the patient to be eligible, the patient must have an immediately life-threatening or serious disease or condition, no satisfactory treatment alternative, unable to enroll in a clinical trial, and use of this drug will not interfere with the development of it or the trials of the drug. Again, we want these potentially helpful drugs to be proven safe and efficacious, and we want them on the market to help a lot of people. And there must be a favorable benefit risk assessment for the patient. The physician in this, in pre-approval access, must identify a promising drug that will help this patient and then request it from a company. Now, if the company agrees, the physician requests FDA sign-off and IRB approval, and IRB is an institutional review board, also called an ethics committee, and these exist to protect patients who are undergoing, usually it's research, but also in this particular case, IRB approval is required as well. And you see, I put up there that the FDA allows 99% of requests to proceed. And then there's also a serious adverse event reporting requirement as soon as possible, but no later than 15 days. And this is important because suppose somebody takes a drug provided via the expanded access pathway and has, say, a cardiac event. This is something that other patients and physicians considering the drug would want to know immediately. And this is something that participants in a clinical trial and those running the trial would want to know immediately. So that's a really important patient safety mechanism right there. And one other thing you'll see is that I put this big red arrow there because this is really important. The company has to agree to provide the drug. Nothing in the regulations, nothing in any law forces a company to provide its drugs via expanded access. So now we're going to talk about right to try. And what I did is I left up the FDA requirements so we can kind of compare how they work. The right to try began as a legislative movement in 2014, and it was created by the Goldwater Institute, which is a libertarian organization that's dedicated to getting government out of individual lives. And it began as on the state level, but it resulted in a federal law being signed in May 2018. So under right to try, single patients can ask for a drug via this pathway, but not intermediate or larger groups. Right to try applies only to drugs and not anything else. And they must be through phase 1 of development and still in active development. And that's quite different from the FDA pathway, where even drugs that haven't gone into phase 1 or are just in a lab, even before animals, there are cases where drugs have been given on an expanded access basis that are very, very, very early in preclinical development. There are informed consent requirements, but they're not strict. There are no requirements in the law for what must go in there. Remember, the FDA requires them to adhere to Code of Federal Regulation standards. And then there is also the same charging stipulation that there's no profit to be made, only direct manufacturing costs, but there is no oversight of this. Remember, the FDA has been legislated out of right to try. So there's no oversight of what a company will charge. And under the FDA, you basically, as we like to say, you have to submit the receipts and show that you're not charging for more than direct costs. Patient eligibility under right to try. Patient must have a life-threatening disease or condition, no satisfactory treatment alternative, unable to enroll in a clinical trial, and a favorable risk-benefit assessment. As in the FDA pathway, the physician identifies a promising drug and requests it from the company, and there you go. There's no FDA sign-off because the goal of right to try is to get the FDA out of the picture. And while the FDA pathway does stipulate that IRBs or ethics committees must sign off, there is no such stipulation in the right to try law. And as for the serious adverse event reporting, as I mentioned, this is a very important one for patient safety, but under right to try, it's only required annually. And right now there's a proposed guidance out that has finished receiving comments, and they're trying to set the conditions for this reporting. It will be annually. They're trying to decide if it's due 2 months after the end of the year, 3 months. And this could be very harmful to patients, because suppose a patient takes a drug and under right to try in January has a serious event. nobody might know about it for a full year or even as much as 12, 13, 14 months later. So I do want to highlight that. Oh, and again, there's the red arrow under right to try as well. The company must agree to give the drug out. It's not mandated in the right to try law itself or anywhere else. So I'm going to cover some of just the major ethical concerns. As Regine said, there are lots of them. They involve consent, especially with right to try and the lack of detailed consent requirements. But some of the bigger ones, the weak informed consent, there's a blanket liability for drug companies under right to try. And that means that if what the company gives a patient is harmful, then there is no legal recourse. The company could also do something intentionally wrong, could give you a vial of lemonade and tell you it's what you asked for, and there's no legal recourse. There's also, again, as I mentioned, the annual not immediate reporting requirements. Oh, I did want to mention about the blanket liability. Under the FDA pathway, the consent contains the phrase that the patient cannot sign away legal rights. And as I mentioned, there's no oversight of what companies can charge under right to try. Now, I don't want to be a complete, negaholic about right to try, but there were some good things to come out of the whole movement. And one of them, I think the biggest one, is the increased awareness of expanded access. A lot of people didn't know that you could actually get drugs before they're approved by the FDA and outside of clinical trials. So that was very important. And it also spurred the FDA to streamline its own expanded access process. It simplified the application form, and the IRB or ethics committee approval that's required was switched from a full board to just the chair or somebody that the chair designates. And finally, there's something called Project Facilitate, and that's an FDA concierge service for oncology, and what the oncologists can call up, and they can be led by the hand through the whole expanded access pre-approval process. We're hoping, and there's word that this will be expanded to other areas. Right now, it's just for oncology. So these were some of the good things to come out of the right to try movement. And then to discuss some of the more like the regulatory policy implications, we're going to go to Christopher Robertson now. We're also going to discuss why this topic is important to companies. And then Richard is going to tell us why this kind of access is of special concern to patients with rare diseases and patients with unmet needs. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Let me open up my slides. Great. So as the designated lawyer in the group, I thought I would start with some law. And so this is the actual excerpt from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which really sets up this pre-market approval system, which is fairly unique. And when we think about consumer products, and I think when we think about drugs as a consumer product, it's fairly unique in requiring the governments to first approve the product before you bring it on the market. And that's a distinctive feature of this regulatory system that really then sets up the rest of our discussion about accessing drugs before that approval. And so if we look at how the FDCA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, defines a drug, it's really the intention of the drug maker that converts any given chemical compound from a cleaning product or a vitamin to an actual drug based on the intent of the drug maker. And it's that intent that it be used in diagnosis or cure or mitigation or treatment of disease. This intention becomes important because that intended effect then creates the next statutory hook, really, for whether the Secretary of HHS, as designated into the FDA, should approve the drug based on its intended uses as recognized on the label. And it really sets up a two-pronged test. One is proof of safety, and the other is proof of efficacy. And if you don't have both of those indicia, then the drug is supposed to be rejected under the statute. So we then have this requirement under the statute that drugs be labeled with adequate instructions for all the intended uses, explaining what doses are appropriate, what populations are appropriate, really the delivery. There's a big difference between an intravenous drug and an oral drug, or a drug to be used on your skin. And so if a drug doesn't have all its intended uses on it under the statute and regulations, it's considered misbranded. And so this is the statutory requirement that requires the company, if they have multiple uses for a drug, they actually need to come back to the FDA and ask for approval for each one so that we can build the evidentiary base for it. So when you put these sets of statutory and regulatory requirements together, they're really designed to compress the company's intended uses with the uses that are proven safe and effective and the labeled uses. So they all then, the ones that appear on the label are those that are proven safe and effective. And that alignment is really the statutory purpose. And you notice this regulatory system reflects this larger principle that before profiting from a product in this domain, you have to prove that it's actually safe and effective. And of course, this is different than other domains, like, for example, nutritional supplements. You don't have to prove they actually will improve your health to get a nutritional supplement on the market, but you do for a drug. And that's why that definition I shared earlier is so important. And I'm going to come back to this principle. I really think it is motivating to help see the forest for the trees. Okay, so if we think about why does the FDA, why did Congress require this pre-market approval process? There's typically an obvious answer. Well, it's some form of paternalism, that the government knows better than you what you should put in your own body. But I think a better explanation is really production of knowledge. Because as we've seen in other domains, if you don't require that proof, it never gets done. And you can have, 20% of our US economy sucked up in healthcare that we never find out whether it's working or not. And so by putting the onus on the company that wants to profit from the product, we force them to produce knowledge so that we can make smarter decisions about what to put in our own bodies. So that really sets up this slide. That's the sort of front door of the FDA, how to get access to a new product. Well, prove it's safe and effective and get a new indication. And that's the first bullet I have here. The second approach to get access to a product, though, is get it approved for one thing, like, say, bladder cancer, but then ask your physician to prescribe it off-label for another thing, like brain cancer, say. And for various legal reasons I don't have time to get into, that's allowed in the US, off-label prescription. And in fact, a lot of times that is the answer that patients seek. There's another drug that's already been proven safe and effective in a related domain, and sort of like going next door and trying it for yourself is a great alternative in some cases. Although most off-label uses have a very poor evidentiary base, and higher adverse events are associated with off-label use. So although that's the sort of next best thing, sort of caveat emptor. The third bullet here, we don't usually put on slides like this, but it's actually kind of important. People have been going to other countries to access drugs for decades. Way back in the 60s, for example, there was a scandal around a product called Latrell that people thought was the next wonder drug for cancer. Turned out it was actually, full of arsenic. But traveling to another jurisdiction is another way to access drugs if they're either approved there or if it's essentially anarchy there. Again, caveat emptor. The next three bullets are really what we're focusing on today, but I do think it's useful to look at this broader context, is clinical trials. The great thing about clinical trials is they're very highly organized, and they can be free or inexpensive for you to participate in. But they often have very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. You have to have just the disease they're trying to treat and maybe even be in an age range that they're trying to target, not have other comorbidities. And another problem is just simply geographic. These tend to be historically done at major academic medical centers, for example. And if you live in a rural area, you might not have a clinical trial going on near you. So Lisa really set up the next two, which are expanded access and right to try. I'll touch on those again in a moment, but let me delve a little further into emergency use authorization, which has been in the news a lot lately due to COVID-19. So the statute, again, putting on my lawyer hat, is under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Section 564 and 564A and 564B, requires this public health emergency like COVID-19. The secretary has to find that there's no adequate approved alternative. They have to find the product that's in front of them, like, for example, the Moderna vaccine may be effective. It's a lower statutory standard than the normal one for approval or for licensing. So I think it's useful to say that there is no approved vaccine right now. There's no licensed vaccine, but there is one that's FDA authorized for emergency use. And then the statute, like a lot of statutes, has just a cost-benefit analysis, weighing the risks versus the benefits. And then finally, there's a requirement that patients that receive have to be told this is not an approved therapy or prophylactic, and you have the option to refuse it. But right now, scholars and lawyers are debating on, well, can that option to refuse have consequences attached to it? Like, can you be required to take the drug or the vaccine as a condition of going to work, for example? I think the answer is yes. Other scholars said no, but we can talk more about that. So going back then to expanded access and right to try, this is a GAO comparison of the two main pathways that largely cover the same ground that Lisa covered. I just thought I'd highlight it again. Is that, one difference between the Expanded Access Program and the Federal Right to Try Act, as you can see here, is that right to try does not apply to phase 1 drugs. These are the early products before they've even gotten into the larger trials. Second, the Expanded Access Program applies to serious ailments, even if they're not life-threatening, whereas the Right to Try Act requires that they be life-threatening. On the other hand, the Right to Try Act cuts out the FDA and also cuts out the IRB, the Institutional Review Board or Ethics Committee. Now, one thing this chart doesn't show is that Lisa alluded to is that under the Right to Try, you cannot sue doctors or companies or even pharmacists that are involved in Right to Try, even if they act negligently in giving you the product. Even if they act unreasonably under the circumstances, you cannot sue them if they injure you. And so, on the other hand, that seems like a big difference under the statute, but in the decades or so leading up to the passage of the statute, researchers have been unable to find any cases of actual liability around expanded access. And I have since tried to update this myself, still can't find anything. Really drives your research assistants crazy, asking them to search for things that don't exist, but that's what they're there for. So why do we not see a bunch of liability around expanded access? Is because the standard operating procedure has all these sorts of checks built into it. First, the legitimate company itself doesn't even get into the business of expanded access unless they're confident about their product and they disclose what they know or they don't know. The patient's physician is the first gateway. They're not even going to propose it if it's not reasonable. Then the FDA is a second gateway to confirm the risks are reasonable. And then you have an IRB coming in to help make sure that the patient understands the choices she's making. And finally, the patient gives a rigorous, robust, informed consent. After going through those 5 gateways, if you end up having that patient sue you, is rare as hen's teeth. So it really presents an interesting choice for the company to say, should we use Right to Try and try to dodge the FDA or dodge the IRB and then avoid paying if we hurt somebody? Or instead go straight through all these checks and make sure that our product isn't going to hurt anyone. And that's why we see most of the major companies, if they get into this space at all, are using expanded access. So in the last part, I just want to touch on how we pay for pre-approval access to drugs, or who pays for it, if at all. And here again, we have that principle of you have to prove it before you can profit from it. And we're in this domain where we haven't yet proven it safe and effective. So the negative implication by modus tollens, if you remember your first year college logic class, is that you can't profit from it. And sure enough, the statute says you can charge companies for giving expanded access or clinical trials, but you have to get the prior authorization of the Food and Drug Administration, and you have to prove to us that it's not going to interfere with trials. You're not going to be diverting patients who would instead be going through trials, so we can keep your drug on track to approval. And I think that's what everyone's shared goal should be, because when you get to approval, you can get insurance coverage, you can get it rolling out into the standard of care, you can reach thousands and thousands and thousands of patients, or millions depending on the product, or dozens depending on the product, that you just can't reach, or you'll never reach through expanded access. And so the FDA says you can charge direct costs of providing the product, but that's not including like the research and development or the facilities. But the problem is that those direct costs are a relatively small portion of the total costs involved with bringing a product to market. I can come back to this in the Q&A, but there's an entire enterprise involved with bringing a new product to market. And the ones that the FDA allows a company to recover costs for are probably actually the minority. In some biologic products, it actually costs a lot of money to produce the unit of drug, but in most cases, the product isn't what's itself costly, it's this entire apparatus around it. And so for this reason, most companies actually don't charge for expanded access if they do provide it in the United States. But there are all these other incidental costs that are in various ways covered by drug makers or healthcare providers themselves, insurers, patients. Some people are even going to crowdsourcing, asking for donations. And just here at the end of the last slide, I just want to mention why insurers tend to not cover this area, is because the contracts that they have with their insureds or patients, and this is true of public insurers too under their policies, exclude coverage for what's called experimental treatments. There are various mandates for clinical trial cost coverage and some distinctions to make around that. But patients typically don't have to pay for clinical trials, or at least not substantially the primary costs. Okay, much more to talk about there. I'm already 90 seconds over my allotted time, but I did want to give you my Twitter handle at Prof. C. Robertson, and you can also check out my book on health insurance. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Rick.
Thanks, both Lisa and Chris. I appreciate y'all teeing this up. So hello, everyone. My name is Rick White. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm a policy analyst at the National Organizations for Rare Disorders, or NORD. And I work mostly on FDA issues, including the pre-approval pathways and really anything that deals with drug development. A little bit about NORD. We were founded in 1983 and represent over 320 different rare disease patient organizations and the rare disease community at large. It's estimated that 1 in 10 Americans are afflicted with a rare disease, meaning NORD represents over 30 million Americans that are struggling with a rare disease nationally. We are committed to the identification, treatment, and cure of rare disorders through programs of education, advocacy, research, and patient services. The issue we are here to speak about is extremely unique: pre-approval access to therapeutics, specifically right to try and expanded access. And as the previous speakers have mentioned, the dynamic history of the program, I hope to talk a little bit about the patient experience. So we've already done an examination of the differences between the pathways, but it's important to note that both processes start with the patient and the provider and end with the sponsor being the sole determinator of access. It's essential that both patients and providers do their research when discussing options. There are resources out there like the FDA's Expanded Access website. Reagan-Udall has an Expanded Access Navigator, and CUPA has some great resources that help inform stakeholders of these processes. The determination to utilize this pathway requires frank conversations about the risk of an experimental treatment and the confidence from both patient and provider in the decision to pursue pre-approval access. I'm glad that these pathways exist, but to utilize them requires that both patients and providers know how these pathways work and that products are available, which is easier said than done. As was mentioned earlier, an unintended consequence of the right to try legislation has been the increased awareness of these programs and pathways, which I ultimately hope ends up being a positive. And an aspect I think is really important to understand is that when patients are at this stage, they're both very determined and very, very sick. Pre-approval access is often the last treatment option. It's really almost impossible to imagine a situation for those of us who have not been in their shoes. The process produces such a spectrum of emotions. For those that have received a pre-approval treatment and it works to halt or reverse disease progression, it's life-changing. But for those who do not get the therapy, or they get the therapy and it doesn't have an effect, it can be absolutely devastating. So as you can imagine, this process is incredibly emotional, and I think everyone in the space knows that and are very respectful of this fact. So why rare patients? Why have a rare disease patient advocate here? So once you think about it, it's kind of logical that patients with rare diseases are more likely to utilize these programs than those with more common conditions. And there are a number of reasons for that. One being that there are fewer clinical treatment options for rare disease patients. Two, the clinical trials that do exist are hard to come by and participate in. And patients with rare diseases are more likely to meet all the criteria for the program, particularly in terms of disease severity. One of the key criteria of these programs is the exhaustion of opportunities to participate in a clinical trial. And clinical trial enrollment is a whole other rabbit hole that we've touched on, but we could talk about for quite some time. But for the purposes of this discussion, many rare disease patients are not able to participate in clinical trials. It's important to remember that randomized, well-controlled trials are essential to the drug development process, and they are carefully tailored to ensure that the population being studied is likely to predict an outcome. This means that the trial's inclusion or exclusion criteria, which are set parameters by the sponsor for patient enrollment into the trial, are strategically chosen by the sponsor. Exclusion criteria are factors that preclude a patient from enrolling in a trial. Patients may not be able to participate in clinical trial because they live too far away from the trial site to reliably participate. They may have comorbidities, which are other diseases or factors that make the subject unable to qualify for the trial, or that the patient is taking some other kind of medication for another disease. The trial also may simply be full, and that there may not be a trial for that patient and their disease. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are common exclusion criteria. And anyone can cause a patient to be excluded from the trial writ large. For rare disease patients, these hurdles are very hard to overcome. Many rare patients often have comorbidities, are taking multiple medications, and geographic distance is a huge hurdle for the entire rare disease community, not just for trials, but beyond that in seeing a physician. So you can see how this creates the perfect storm of trial exclusion. So once the search for clinical options are exhausted, that's where an individual might be inclined to seek out a product in a pre-approval setting. I just want to touch very quickly on the right to try legislation. When the bill was being considered in 2017 and 18, that was before my time at NORD, but we worked very hard to oppose the bill for a variety of reasons, including the excising of the FDA and the lack of robust patient protections, namely informed consent and IRB approval and FDA interactions. We took to the Hill to educate lawmakers and staff, joined with almost 100 other patient organizations, and issued statement after statement, essentially saying that this bill was an overbroad solution in need of a problem. There were certainly arguments to be made about the burden of the expanded access process, but the FDA was committed to reform, and the solution of cutting out the FDA was far too extreme for the issue at hand. This came at a time when the FDA was approving 99% of expanded access requests. And then, as is now, the company can still decline to offer the treatment for any reason. And somewhere along the way, this became the FDA's fault. And despite the historic reality that patients have suffered time and time again when a medical product is not evaluated by an independent regulator for safety and effectiveness and given right to a patient. Since the passage, the effect of right to try has been modest. There are reports of handfuls of people claiming to have utilized the pathway, but they are few and far between. And we are far from the promised flood of experimental treatments going to terminally ill patients. But from what is being reported, many companies are still using the expanded access pathway. So despite the law being relatively new, it's becoming clear that the agency was not the problem, and more likely, interactions with the agency had and are still proving to have value to the sponsor. In these expanded access requests, the FDA has been known to offer advice on assessing dosing and recommended safety improvements for the experimental use. In many ways, sponsors get some extra free advice from the agency because ultimately the FDA wants to be helpful and protect the patient. The shift in FDA's role makes it a much more passive player in the process and makes it harder for the agency to understand the universe of investigational drugs being used in right to try. As I mentioned before, many sponsors have chosen to continue to utilize the FDA expanded access program despite the existence of the right to try pathway because the process is that much more robust. I think it's important to understand these concepts we've talked about today because in the past, there's been a real lack of understanding about what is reasonable for the FDA and sponsors. And that's led to this political movement, which is at best misguided. We've talked about the difference between FDA expanded access and right to try law, and it's really unfortunate to have had this split happen, especially if the differences in the program cause patients and physicians to take valuable time to evaluate which option they should pursue. NORD strongly believes that the role FDA plays in the pre-approval process and are glad they are committed to the expanded access program. As mentioned before, the passage of Right to Try has led to a bit of renewed attention to the expanded access program at FDA, going so far as in the start of COVID, Dr. Cavazzoni issued a press release to assure rare patients that they wouldn't be forgotten and essentially mention that expanded access is an option available to them as these treatments are in development. I think almost everyone in this virtual room appreciates the work that the FDA does, but there are people who think differently, and it's on us to acknowledge that the best way to protect patients in these settings is to support the FDA. I think it's very easy for people to forget, especially in medicine, that slipping standards have the most severe consequences and often serious illness or death. We're only 60 or 70 some odd years away from thalidomide that started the need for all these protections, and each time the groups have taken a bite out of the regulatory standards, patients have suffered. Which leads me to some concerning incidents that Right to Try has created, which is an opportunity for bad actors to enter the space. It's always challenging as a patient organization or human generally to see grifters come in and try to profit off serious illness by hyping up a product and selling basically sophisticated snake oil to a patient because both the patient and the product would meet the Right to Try criteria. It's unfortunate, and it just gives us another thing to be wary about in the patient advocacy world. Right to Try is the law of the land, so our role is to advocate for all the players in the arena to do the right thing by encouraging ethical behavior and ensuring that sponsors who utilize the Right to Try pathway are extremely diligent about their reporting, especially adverse events, in a timely manner. At the end of the day, this issue does come down to the sponsors. Many companies that offer pre-approval access are applauded and rightfully so, but companies are under no obligation to provide their medicine to a patient for any number of reasons. However, recently we've seen companies be more transparent and proactive about their Right to Try expanded access philosophies to combat misinformation and hopefully bad actors. Companies involved in Right to Try should have a section on their website detailing the program for the public. And the trade group Pharma recently released principles last year on best practices for clinical trials for their member companies. And one of the principles was increasing expanded access for patients. And while these principles are voluntary, it demonstrates that industry is thinking about this issue and supportive of it. And it's reassuring to see that everyone is on the same page in a relative manner of speaking. So in conclusion, I think that the agency has proven over and over again that they are willing to work with sponsors and patients who have little to no options in a way that accomplishes their fundamental mission of protecting patients. Examples in this pre-approval space, the expanded access program, the establishment of the Reagan-Udall Navigator, Project Facilitate that was mentioned earlier, and not to mention the other activities that the agency undertakes in order to speed access to sick patients, like the expedited approval pathways, which allow for bold treatments to reach vulnerable patients, utilizing innovative regulatory mechanisms, the priority review programs, and more recently, the focus on individualized therapies. In short, the FDA uses every tool in their toolbox to help sick patients, and I think that's never been truer than today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. And thank you to all our panelists. Please continue to submit your questions through the Q&A function on your screen. We already have some of the questions. One is for you, Chris. Are there reporting differences for Right to Try versus expanded access?
Short answer, yes. Under expanded access, the sponsor is supposed to report to FDA basically continuously, as quickly as reasonably possible upon learning of adverse events. Whereas under Right to Try, Congress specified that the sponsor would only need to disclose once annually in a summary fashion, and the statute itself didn't specify even what that summary would have to say. And so that's the process that Lisa mentioned is still being fleshed out by the regulators to try to extract as much information as you can from it, so that it actually produces a safety signal for the company and the FDA. But it really does create a black box for that first year when expanded access could be pretty critical.
And the other question is, I think, Rick, you can answer that. Thank you, Chris. For early access program, clinical trials provide pre-approval access to patients via a formal clinical trial. So part of this approach supports collection of detailed safety information. So what is possible to collect a similar level of clinical data for single patient's requests?
I think this is a great question, and I don't know if I have an answer right off the top of my head. I think it does speak to the differences of what process a patient needs to go through in advance of this pre-approval pre-approval access. But if any of the other panelists have thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them.
I have additional thoughts. I'm not an expert on this, on what's called real world evidence, actually, but I do know that I mentioned that there were three types of expanded access. There's single patient, there's what they call intermediate, which is more than one and maybe up to 100. These numbers aren't specified by the FDA. And then there are larger cohort expanded access programs, which could be hundreds and even thousands. And for those following the COVID news, there was a gigantic expanded access program at the Mayo Clinic for convalescent plasma. And that had close to 100,000 patients or participants enrolled. And that is unusual. It is allowed, but they're not usually, I think that's the largest ever expanded access cohort. The two larger cohorts are more similar to clinical trials. They're not the same, but the good thing about them is that they are able to collect some data because they have a good deal of patients in there, and there are strict requirements. Like I said, I'm not an expert. If Chris knows, he can jump in. For single patient, I think it's very, very hard to get data. First of all, you can't require physicians to report it. But second of all, it's just, these are so much one-off. Now, I will say that I think Rick referred to individualized therapies. And that's something that I've been researching lately. And these are custom crafted, often genetic therapies for just one patient. And when you have just one patient receiving something, any data from that usage is valuable. And also, if you have just a few patients, as you often have with rare diseases, any data from that is useful, whether it does much more than inform possibly a treatment decision. I don't think that they're used to inform regulatory decisions. And one more thing I'll say just very quickly in the context of COVID is that in the midst of this horrible worldwide pandemic, and people are just racing to try to find anything that would help, anything used during these kinds of conditions, there should be data collected on that, because this is a very particular situation where you really want to know right away if there's especially harm, but also possibly benefit. I don't know if Chris has anything to add to that.
I mean, I've just added that more generally as a healthcare system, as a system of systems, we need to do a much better job of tracking outcomes and moving towards a sort of broader learning system. It was amazing to me, even in say July, when we were looking at that point, hundreds of thousands of patients had been treated for COVID-19. But if you looked at the key studies that were being published in last summer, it was like, oh, we did a study of 297 patients, and another study was like, oh, we did one. This is a big study of 900 patients. But it was like looking at the pandemic through a pinhole. Mm-hmm. And so, I think this point is valid, but it should really be expanded beyond the EA or the context to our sort of healthcare system knowledge, ecology more generally, to use big words.
And adding to that, the other question we have, can you use right to try data to support submission like with expanded access?
I can't see that I can't see the FDA doing, no. I mean, regulatory, Rick, go ahead, but. I mean, they only have to report once a year, and that requirement hasn't even been, officially codified yet. So I don't know if they're even reporting now. So I would say no. And the other thing is that very, very, very few cases, publicized cases of right to try have happened since 2018 when the federal law was signed. So, I mean, there's just not a lot of use, so there's no data there. And as Rick said, and Chris too, actually, that, most of the big companies and reputable companies will go the FDA way and go under the imprimatur of the FDA, and also just, ensure the patient safety.
I'll add to this. There is, so one of the features of the RTT statute that we didn't have time to touch on yet is there is an exclusion actually from the FDA relying on any data from the right to try experience, unless the company opts in to the FDA relying on that data, or the Secretary of Health and Human Services makes a determination that it's just essential that they do. But the idea was that they didn't want the risk of an adverse outcome jeopardizing the FDA approval process. And so the framers of the RTT tried to blind the FDA to that process, although it's an imperfect blind for the reason I suggested. In doing so, I would say Congress left open the possibility that the FDA could rely on the data in a positive way to support an approval, in theory. But I think the FDA will often be asking, well, if you're doing this systematically, why didn't you do that as a group expanded access program that we could have helped you design, and then we might have had meaningful information. But bringing us these 4 patients that you did in this right to try context, is sure you can give it to us, but it's just not going to be very persuasive. And the last point I'll just, the main way you bring data for an approval is through pre-registered clinical trials that you have negotiated with the FDA. And so just in terms of weighting, those trial outcomes are going to be 100 times more important and persuasive to the FDA than any number of right to try or expanded access, really anecdotes. Sure, the FDA can think about those and look at them, but they're just not nearly as important as the more systematic approach. That's why the FDA is there in the first place, is to facilitate that systematic approach.
Yeah, I'd agree. A couple patients does not a clinical trial make.
And we have another question in the queue as well. Thank you. So it's asking, does anyone have data on the effects of project facilitate on oncology expanded access, more requests handled, a faster request handling? Or
yeah. I would direct the questioner and anybody else interested to the Project Facilitate site. Just Google Project Facilitate. You'll go there. They did actually just, I think it was just within about the past 6 months or so, they released data. And I think I'm trying to remember. I think it was possibly in the hundreds. I don't quote, if any of if Chris or Rick or somebody else even listening heard that, or Sage, I have that information, but you should be able to find it on the site. And if not, you can email me, but that was presented.
Yeah, as I recall, the Reagan-Udall Foundation that did an evaluation. It came out positive. Project Facilitate's helping. I don't have the data ready to present or anything. But that's really motivated some broader conversations. Why aren't we doing this same thing for other areas of the FDA as well? Project Facilitate's focus, as the questioner said, is on oncology, but it's a great model to throw open the front doors to receive these sorts of access requests.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have some more questions, but we are really just about out of time. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all again for joining us. We hope you have found this interesting. We always take feedback very seriously. So if you have questions we didn't get to answer or ideas for upcoming webinar, please email Coupa Project Manager Sage Gustafson, and her email is in the chat, or reply to any of the emails you've received from Eventbrite about this event. We also have a wide range of additional resources on our Cooper website, the link to which is in the chart. I want to take a moment to remind you all about our upcoming Cooper courses, which we are putting on in conjunction with the University of Arizona Health Law Program. The deadline to apply for the Patient Scholarship Program is on March 21st. And we hope that you apply or send that information to whomever might be interested. There is more information on that in the chat as well. Again, thank you very much for attending. Stay safe and have a wonderful day.